done that, not as much as I would like, but just to go and walk with one of the chaplains, and walk down to the graveyard and to the grave area and just watch them do their thing. No mission. I mean, no purpose to be there other than ministry of presence to those guys. It's very important.
Yes, sir.
And we've been blessed with strong leadership. If you think about who we've had there over the years, like Steve Berry, there's few finer than him as far as a mentor and leader. Then Brent Causey, Mike Durham. I mean, just Al Buckner.
Walker was there at one time too. Seems to me he was there when I did the funeral for my cousin.
Yeah, it's just, so we've had our finest, I mean, MDW, I mean, I remember Brent Causey when he first came here, he said how much weight he had to lose just to get in the old guard look, that V-shaped body.
Yes, the same thing's true on the West Point faculty, by the way, sir.
Yep.
You can't teach up there if you don't meet.
Yeah, and that's another place. We're talking about places of ministry of presence and the fact that they have their own distinct zero defects. I mean, you can't bolo one of those missions like at West Point or at Arlington or Walter Reed. You can't do it. And we've been very successful. And again, up at West Point, I'm thinking of Mike Durham. There's few finer than him. I mean, he's just. And I had to get that approved and blessed by the superintendent.
Yes, you did.
That's a hand-picked assignment. Expectations be 4 or 5 years. Of course, then prior to that, John Cook. That's another thing. As I think about the core, and we got back to the homiletics piece, the quality of chaplains that we have. When they were looking for a pastor for Coral Ridge Presbyterian, there were almost 200 resumes, and one of our chaplains was in the top 3 of all the resumes that were looked for to be the pastor of Coral Ridge to follow D. James Kennedy. You look at John Cook, after he leaves West Point, he gets called to one of the largest churches there at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, outside the gates, where he's ministering to primarily a military congregation. It's just the caliber. Mike Milton, one of our reservists, who not only is a fantastic preacher, but he's also a seminary professor at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte. And when we had our first homiletics workshop, I think you were there, we were looking for these outside big name homileticians, preachers to come in, and Ken Bush said, well, we really don't need to do that. We've got some in the likes of Mike Milton and R.J. Gore, and to me, that's a change in the chaplaincy. Whereas instead of going for the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian pastor or going here and there, we have gone internally and have found these great homileticians, expositors of the Word. It's unbelievable.
In years past, you might remember Wayne Learer was known as a great preacher.
Yes.
John Hoagland, who was director of PER for a while, was a wonderful preacher. David Peterson used to pack the gates at Fort Bragg when he preached. So we've been blessed with a number of really good ones. And then we have some that just never had any training at all, and they're stumbling along. But that doesn't mean they're going to be bad preachers. It just means they haven't had mentoring and instruction.
Yeah, I mean, I think about Darrell Thompson, who can pack a congregation anywhere, as he's doing in Kuwait. We're sending him out to Leavenworth, and out there he will pack it. You got Walt Hoskins, who packed out Fort Benning. We moved into Leavenworth, and they're packing that out. It's just just simply amazing.
That's good. You want to do some fun questions?
Sure.
I hope this will be fun. I reviewed your calendars, as many as I could get. You have an average of about 2 TDY trips a week.
Right.
Some are longer than others. You visited just about every place where UMTs or RSTs could gather to meet you in the regimental sergeant major.
Right.
Are there some of those trips that remain in your memory longer than others? Are there some that were really more important than others? And I wrote down a whole bunch, like the Horn of Africa, because you went down there. I don't know what you went for in all these places.
The Horn of Africa, I have physically not been yet, not to the Horn of Africa. I've planned but didn't get there.
Oh, you didn't go to Djibouti or someplace?
No, I was trying to get there and it just has not gotten on the calendar.
Well, that's good, so I'll take that out. But see, I can't tell from the calendars whether you went or not.
Right.
Okay. Australia, I know you went there once.
Well, I'm planning to go there. You know where you probably had me? We went to South Africa.
Oh, okay.
I went to Cape Town, South Africa.
Okay.
That was for the International Chief of Chaplains Conference.
Okay.
With Mario Cornelius, who is the Chaplain General for the South Africans. That was. There's an annual Chief of Chaplains, International Chief of Chaplains Conference that was actually begun as a part of NATO, and it was begun by, can't remember the chaplain's name right now, but he was Jim Holt. Remember Jim Holt, Chaplain Colonel Jim Holt? He saw the need for the chaplains of NATO together for professional development. So he began doing that around Europe, and I think there was one in the USA, and this thing has exploded, and so the nations of the Pacific and the African nations that wanted to come, and so they held one in South Africa. We had Desmond Tutu came and addressed us. We had, which was also, that was a very inspiring talk. We had the Secretary of Defense, who was about 35 years old. He spoke to us. We had a gentleman who had been a part during apartheid. He had opened a mail bomb and had lost both of his hands. And so here he is up there and just talking about redemption and some things and forgiveness. That was probably one of our best trips. First of all, just to go to South Africa, because it took forever. Really? But the fraternal, the friendship, I won't forget in Cape Town, because we were at a gathering, and I happened to be at a table primarily with the chiefs of chaplains from Sierra Leone and Zambia, and Zimbabwe, Burundi, and a couple who had been to our chaplain school. And so here we are talking about national problems, and I'm trying to understand, especially in Africa, some of their major issues with crime, child soldiers, human slavery, poverty, starvation, asking how I could pray for them. But then they said, how can we pray for you? And I thought, with all that you've got going on the African continent, and yet not only how could we pray for you, but we pray for the United States of America on a regular basis. And that was one of those moments that left me kind of speechless, like, you pray for us? I mean, but that said something to me about the community of faith, or in this case, talking to primarily Christian chiefs of chaplains, the body of Christ, and also how they shared with me of all of the major problems they're dealing with them from faith-based initiatives. They're dealing with HIV from faith-based initiatives, teaching purity and the sanctity of marriage. It's just amazing.
Yes,
so
sir.
that was one of my favorite trips.
Right. And I would assume that you might have 2 or 3 others that were really favorite. But before I forget it, you've been to Afghanistan or someplace every Thanksgiving over there in that theater for 5 years. So that must have been important to you. Well, important to me and important to Sonny and my family. Yes. We've been to, I've spent my Thanksgiving in the desert of either Kuwait, Afghanistan, or Iraq since 2002. Of course, in 2002 we were building up shortly after 9/11 for the war, and I think it's 2002. I've been there every Thanksgiving except one since 2002. The first year I was at the school in 2004. I missed it, but I've been there ever since. It's been a blessing, and it reminds me of when we were young chaplains. You spend Thanksgiving with the troops,
put on your dress blues and you're in the in the dining facility or the hospital or wherever. In this case, it was put on the ACUs and I'm with the troops at Thanksgiving, and it's I've always been overwhelmed by, first of all, the way in which our government tries to take care of our troops abroad, the symbols and objects of home, Thanksgiving, are probably some of my fondest memories in making me grateful and thankful to God for such a blessed nation, and to have such a ministry as a chaplain, our chaplain assistant, being with troops during the holidays. It just seems that that's been the door that's open. It's been easier to get into theater during Thanksgiving than Christmas, and yeah, that's been a blessing.
Cool. You think of any trips offhand? I'm thinking about Oconus that caused you to come back and really change something. I mean, it had an impact on you that wasn't just, hey, this was good ministry, this was good pastoral ministry, but hey, I didn't know what was going on over there. I'm going to have to change something. And I'm not fishing for personnel stuff, but I just mean, for example, I heard somebody say that the first time you went to Afghanistan, sir, you got off the plane and you said, I guess it was to Chaplain Bailey, Afghanistan is nothing like Iraq.
Well, it's definitely two different theaters. Well, one thing, if you mentioned Ray Bailey, I will tell you a conversation I had with Ray Bailey when he was there, that Thanksgiving, if you will. And I remember standing out on the tarmac, getting ready to leave theater. That was an interesting trip, because we didn't go back to Kuwait as normal. The weather was so bad we had to go to Manas, Kyrgyzstan, which was really out in the middle of nowhere. But I remember having a conversation with Ray Bailey because he was seriously considering that he was done with the Army, and he was going to go back from that assignment as the 173rd Command Chaplain, and he was going to get out of the Army. I remember speaking with him there, and told him, I said, the Lord's not finished with you yet in the military, let's pray about this. And because we're in the process of making, I think that was when I was visiting him and talking to him about an assignment as the Director of Combat Development at the school.
So 2007.
Yeah, whenever it was.
When he was a senior chaplain.
I remember, yes, going down and seeing or hearing some comments regarding our chaplains needing some additional focus or training on just ministering the right sacraments and ordinances with precision and professionalism. I remember hearing, and so we changed the emphasis at the school on those things, which you would expect that they would come from their denominations. I remember a chaplain telling me that he had noticed one of his chaplains sweating bullets prior to the memorial ceremony for two of his soldiers, and he said, I thought he had a fever or he was sick. I asked him what was going on, and he said that young chaplain told me that he had never done a funeral before, had never seen dead bodies, and I went back and immediately says, we need to change our focus on helping our troops, our chaplains, feel comfortable around death and dying, because they're going to do a lot of it. And I think that was about the time the school decided to partner with the University of South Carolina and take them to visit a funeral home, to talk to a funeral director, to go over to watch an autopsy, and to experience the whole death and dying piece. So yeah. I think one of the wonderful things about visiting on the ground, you get to see some things, you get to assess the training, you get to clarify any issues, you get to give a professional update to the UMTs on the ground about what's going on. But I'll tell you, predominantly what I have always left Oconus, be it Korea, Germany, Afghanistan, Kuwait, is to see the great desire to minister to our soldiers, bring in soldiers to God to soldiers. And I've always just come back saying, wow, we've got a great Corps. I remember Kuwait, the place where they worship there in that big former Post Theater. Just a very big, sort of a neutral, almost a hollow setting. But one of the things, just poor sound equipment, and just hoping and praying that, and even looking for Chief of Chaplain's dollars to help with the. They have one of the best sound systems in any of our chapels in the world. Wow. Someone saw the vision, chaplains asked for the need, and it is a state-of-the-art sound system to ensure that our troops have the best experience in a worship service. I remember also, this one's sort of humorous. In fact, it just happened. I was at Fort Hood, and a young African-American captain comes to me at the Post Hotel. And she says, "Hello, Chaplain Carver. I remember last time I saw you, it was Thanksgiving in Kandahar." She said, "I was the choir director for the gospel choir there in Kandahar." And I told her what I remembered about that is that I was sitting in this congregation, standing room only, almost 450 soldiers, out in the middle of the desert. And I said, "Your choir walked out in choir robes, and someone says that the Baghdad choir doesn't have anything over the Kandahar choir." It was kind of a battle of the choirs, and such pride in the choirs that had grown up literally out of the desert. So, you know, my choir is better than the choir in Kuwait or Iraq. The best one in theater, the best one in CENTCOM is in Kandahar. I just thought that was interesting, odd, and it was heartwarming to see that kind of pride in your combat choir.
They obviously viewed it as something fun and something meaningful.
Yeah. I remember, when you asked about remembers, I just shared this the other day. I was in Kuwait prior to us going north. This is in the spring of 2003. And I walked into the big old circus tent where we held our worship services, and there was about 4 or 5 soldiers in a prayer circle. So I walked over and just sort of joined them, and what I remember is that they were praying for one of their E7 NCOs whose wife had just had a miscarriage, and he was heading back, prior to the war beginning, heading back to be with his wife who just had a miscarriage. And what I remember is seeing the puddle of tears on that plywood floor. It was on their boots, and it was on that floor, and hearing every now and then just these little drops of tears that were going down from these Hua soldiers, you know, loaded to the gill with weapons of war and all this other, and yet they had stopped, and they were interceding for their supervisory sergeant, and that's a priceless moment.
Wow. That's a title for a chapter in your memoirs when you decide to write it. Teardrops on their boots.
Teardrops on their boots.
Could also be a country music song.
It would be.
Teardrops on my boots. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and
you didn't say much about your trip in 2009 to Korea. And
well, I hadn't gotten there yet because
you hadn't been there yet. Okay.
The Korea trip could have been one of my favorite trips, because I think that's the one that was that the one that Sam Boone took us on, or was that the one with? I remember 2 trips to Korea. One, I remember Sam Boone. It was my first trip to Korea, and he wanted to ensure that I saw how big Korea was.
Yes, sir.
And so we didn't do it by chopper. We did it by a van with the hardest seat that I have ever sat on. It didn't give it all, no springs. And we went from the DMZ all the way down south to Osan, and we saw Korea, and we saw the troops.
This was in April of 2009. Sonny went with us, and
yeah, that was the second trip.
We started off with a prayer breakfast at 06 after you had landed at midnight. Then you went from there to see a couple of commanders, and then you went to preach you preached twice in Korean churches. You took Sonny to the DMZ, then we went to Camp Humphreys, then we went to Camp Red Cloud, then you had dinner with Korean Methodists, and then somewhere in there was a day off for Sonny to go shopping, and then you went, preached again, and then took off for China.
Yeah, that was an interesting trip, because let me tell you how it began. It began with getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get ready for the sunrise service here at Arlington. And so we did the Arlington ceremony and ran home to change clothes so we could catch a plane to Korea. And so we really kind of began that trip tired, and there was not much white space in that trip, as you recall.
I did.
And you're right. It was wonderful being in a variety of settings with soldiers excited about their faith, excited about serving.
That was 2 years ago this week.
That was 2 years ago this week. And then we went to those huge churches. One that I had always wanted to attend, the Yodo Church, Dr. Paul Young Cho, in the heart of Seoul. 1 million members. And so we preached in his church. They were apologizing because it was either a midweek service or something, but they only had 22,000 in attendance. And they were broadcasting it to, like, you know, all the Far East countries, Vietnam and everywhere, Thailand, and Paul Buck and I were. He was interpreting as I preached. That was just that was a trip or a ministry experience of a lifetime. Preaching to all those people as far as the eye could see. Out in that huge congregation. The other one was the Myeongsung Presbyterian Church. And they apologized because it was also a Wednesday night or something. They only had 9,000 there. And what I remember about that church was as we walked up to the pulpit to preach, you took your shoes off and put on sandals, or because it was holy ground. So you didn't walk up there in your street shoes, which was very humbling.
Those people are touching people to me, not only because of their dedication, because they started with nothing, but also because they're so incredibly polite.
I know. Then I went to Prayer Mountain, where they pray 24 hours a day, and to see Prayer Mountain for the first time, and to then realize that Paul Buck, Chaplain Paul Buck's father, helped found that huge Yodo church as well as Prayer Mountain. And we went to the little crypts where people from all over the world come to pray in these little holes in the ground. And then also, haven't done this often, but Paul told me his parents were buried there, so we went and stood over the grave of his mother and father at Prayer Mountain. And to stand with one of my chaplains, you know, over such great saints in the kingdom of God, it was just a memorable experience, as you can imagine. You've done the same, but wow, I mean, to be standing in Korea with a Korean American chaplain over his parents was quite interesting.
Now, you must have enjoyed Garmisch, because you went to Garmisch. I mean, I heard you say that you really missed Europe.
Europe is one of our favorite places, and I tell you, if it weren't for the grandbabies, and who knows what Lord has, and I love Europe. And again, one of the highlights, one of those trips. You mentioned life-changing. You know, Ray Bailey is one of our strategic leaders, and to go to Garmisch and see what he's going to pull out of his hat each year for the senior leader training, and to have it at such a glorious place like Garmisch, so inspirational, so majestic. There's not a bad view in any room at the Edelweiss. Those have always been very special as we've not only just spoken, but addressed chaplains from all over Europe. Of course, they've increased that to some of the international chaplains who come there. That's just always been a very inspiring 2 weeks of training, actually. I've really enjoyed that.
I noticed on the content side of all of that his training schedule that Mitch Lewis and Peter Bactus and Ray Bailey contributed to was probably the most sophisticated training schedule I've seen in the field.
Yeah, I would agree. In fact, they are competing with the excellence of the Chief of Chaplain Senior Leader training. As far as, I mean, I have to admit, it was that strategic. And not only, the other thing I'd say about the training that all those guys put together on the USER staff was, it was also not something that just was provided at Garmisch. I saw them implementing and taking that, really becoming a part of the commander's training program all over Europe, as the USER Chaplain's Office has done with the USER Commander. in providing spiritual leadership and strategic resiliency types of training for the senior leadership, officers and NCOs. I almost remember, obviously it's had an impact, because I remember even some of the speakers that they had talking about either religious leader liaison, the importance of dialogue, interfaith dialogue. That's another one of those things that I've taken from some of that training and brought back to implement.
Super.
Yeah, so the OCONUS trips they have been highlights, because just even though in remote places away from the United States, the quality of training, they've not skipped a beat. In some respects, they are already far-reaching out into the future.
Well, I'm going to talk to the Sergeant Major, and I'm going to get some pictures. We're going to have a section on trips and things like that in the book.
Good.
This could be done very quickly, I think.
Okay.
But one of the things that I need to ask you about are policies. I printed them all. I got them right here. I don't need to ask you what the policy is, sir, because I know what it says. Yeah. Want to do this later? I can wait. You can see him. I'm not going anywhere.
Let's. I think he's only going to be here for a few minutes. If you want to stop the camera.
Oh yes, sir. I'll move that out of the way.
No, you're fine, because it's a short one, and you may want to hear. I'll let you hear this.
All right, whatever you say, sir.
Just make sure the thing's not rolling.
Not rolling. Really shouldn't be very difficult.
Right.
Let's see. I can.
And you can start. You can ask. Well, that's okay. You can start with the start, open, and I'll answer what I can, and then we'll move out here.
The only thing I need in order to put this in the book and to explain to readers that might be reading it 20 years from now is why we have these policies.
Okay.
Now, the first one was 25 September 2007. Policy for protection of confidential communications between unit ministry team members and military constituents. I know that we've had a confidentiality policy forever, but the question was, why did we have to have an update?
Yeah. What happened on this one is that commanders began asking questions, although we talked about confidentiality. Commanders, well, there's two things that actually happened. The commanders were asking, what are the left and right limits of confidentiality? What are the rules of engagement? And the other significant issue was that the Marines and the Air Force had absolute confidentiality. And we did not, as I recall, as the Army chaplaincy, have absolute confidentiality, and then it gets a little sticky with, well, if it's Title 32 or Title 10. And so we decided to ensure that we would not confuse in this joint arena. If I, as a Marine, am talking to the Army chaplain, it's not absolute, but if I'm talking to the Air Force, it is. So we wanted to have one standard, one level of confidentiality that applied across all services. Now, Phil, you want to add any more to it?
So the only two other things is, even within our own service, we had different levels of confidentiality. Certain denominations or faith groups, like the Catholic Church, had a much different level. So we were trying to level the playing field. There was also several UCMJ actions that were potentially going to require chaplains to reveal something they had obtained in terms of counseling. And so we were trying to make sure that we had a standard.
That's right. I forgot, about the same time, there was a change in policy that chaplains could serve as court-martial board members. But again, since it's always about the service member, the primary reason for the changing of the policy when I signed it was because we wanted to have one standard so that there was no confusion among our soldiers, sailors, air Marines, and guardians, and therefore we went.
And you did have some chaplains deciding on their own what they would and wouldn't do, and so we wanted to.
That you're exactly right, but that's what that was about.
Good, thank you very much. Next one, chaplains as non-combatants. The purpose of this is to reiterate Chief of Chaplain's policy that chaplains are non-combatants and as such will not bear arms or participate in weapons training. 22 April 2008. I assume this reflects some questions that are coming back because I heard them in the C4 course about whether we could carry weapons. And
well, there was a number of things about that. I mean, obviously the dynamic has always been there. Dating back to, George Washington did not want chaplains to carry weapons, period. He didn't think that was appropriate. They did. It wasn't until the Civil War that there was an agreement by both sides that chaplains would be non-combatants.
Okay.
Now, there have been individuals that have acted throughout history since then on their own without to carry weapons, and it happened in Vietnam. It's happened as recently as 2003 in Iraq. It's still there. The potential is there. We have training. We have, I guess, chaplains that confuse training opportunities where the requirement to carry weapons, such as Ranger School, it's a training aid, and therefore, the Ranger Regiment has said if you want chaplains to go through and you're not going to have them carry a weapon, then they're not going through. So we've tried to make it very clear that that is a unique distinction. It is a one-time only thing, and it's only because of that particular training. You don't want to confuse people with what the chaplain is there for if you see him or her carrying a weapon.
This has not been one of those prevailing issues on my watch as the Chief of Chaplains as it has been previously.
Okay.
One of the reasons I did this, in addition to what Phil just said, was I wanted to reiterate the importance of our status as non-combatants. It needed to be stated by me with one caveat. And the caveat, besides the Ranger training and some other things, was some of our chaplains were starting to get really involved in various levels of combatives.
Okay.
And just a reminder to them that we use these hands to bless. We are about being non-combatants and the healing, nurturing, caring, praying business instead of your hands,
registered,
being registered, and and that was the big deal. We've only had a few cases in my watch as the chief. We've had to reiterate this to the special community, just to remind them this is what we do. We're non-combatants, and let's make sure it's never confused by anyone within the Army or the Corps. And if you choose to walk across that line, you're really making it hard for the rest of us. So that was the real extent behind this one.
By the way, you do have one sentence in there that's different as far as my research was concerned. When Chaplain Arnold in World War II decided, as not only a priest but as our first Major General priest, it was really a bad idea for chaplains to carry weapons. He went to the VJAG, TJAG. TJAG says if chaplains are carrying weapons wearing crosses, they've committed a war crime, perfidy, because you have a sign or symbol on that says you're a non-combatant, but you're carrying a weapon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, John, I mean, that's true, but medics have the same problem.
Yes, understood. But what's different about this policy is, for a long time, people like Pat Hessian and others came along and said, well, you put everybody else's non-combatant immunity in jeopardy. And this one, it reminds the chaplains, in the last sentence, you might lose your ecclesiastical endorsement, which is something I hadn't seen before.
Well, we had a chaplain down at the Ranger Training Brigade advocating out loud that chaplains should be allowed to carry weapons, to the point that his predecessor had to call him in and tell him face to face that was a no-go. And not all denominations have stipulations for their chaplains that would automatically prevent them or preclude them from carrying weapons. You also have the Geneva Convention, which allows it for self-defense, and we've had chaplains take that and stretch that into an offensive type effort.
I will say during my watch, what was, I think, vitally important was the time I spent with the special community.
Special ops.
Special ops, JSOC, others, even downrange, and having this conversation sort of in a non-attribution setting for me to explain this policy while sitting in the mountains of Afghanistan or Iraq, talking to them as they were constantly going in and out of places. That was very valuable.
Yes,
This was timely when that came out, and it's not been an issue.
Yes, sir. Okay. This may not be a policy field, but this is what I got sent. This is chapel auxiliaries. And basically what it says is that the Military Council of Catholic Women and Protestant Women of the Chapel should be supported by resources, by commanders. Evidently, Al Kobe thought it was a policy, whether it is or not.
So we only have 3 policy letters signed by the chief. I mean, they're actual policy letters.
Yeah. And this is the other one, religious leader liaison.
Yes, sir, that is the 3rd. That's the only.
There's a reason for this one.
Okay.
We were wanting to make a point across not only the Army within our chain of command, but also to the other services, because we as the Army, we really do support the Army. I mean, we support the MCCW and the PWOC with well, as close as you can. And it was almost an opportunity for, let's say, the PWOCs, where there are chapters that are from the other service, to see what the Army has done as a statement of support of how we support them with money, resourcing, and the command. And that was part of our, let's say, implied intent for that.
Okay.
And by God's providence, it's going to become very important as we go to more joint basing opportunities. So that, because when we're with the Air Force or Navy, this is going to have a big say in how those funds joint base are used.
And what we did shortly after this was to show, in the context of the Armed Forces Chaplaincy Board, how many PWC and MCCW chapters that there were, and how much money was coming out of the offering plate, predominantly from the Army, to support. And there's an important sentence in here, verse 4. While the Army has the majority of chaplain auxiliary chaplains meeting on installations, membership and support from the Air Force and Navy are increasing.
Okay.
So that was the, like, would be great, guys from the other services, if you could jump on board and help with this, because you've got people coming, and we're going to support these folks, but the Army's doing like 90% of the funding.
Got it.
That's what that was about.
Okay.
It's interesting.
I got it, sir. All right. I'm pretty well read into religious leader liaison, because I remember.
Right.
I mean, there are all kind of strategic and operational and tactical reasons why you do that, and we have put chaplains in, like Tim Bedsoe at the corps level. And
that's been an outgrowth of that. The original need for the policy letter, again, was at the joint environment, the other services either shied away, did not have policy, or shied away and said, we can't do this. And so we wanted to be very clear that it was important, but it wasn't important to the point where a chaplain went out and did it by himself or herself. It had to be part of the commander's campaign plan. It had to have the full-on cooperation and interconnectedness of all the aspects of the commander, from security to the operations to supply to communications. All of those things were, and then there were definite left and right limits, and we wanted to make sure we had this written so that, again, we didn't have those out there doing what was right, what they thought was right in their own mind, type thing.
I understand.
Yep.
You know what's fascinating to me, Chaplain Wright? By the way, Chaplain Wright gave me a great interview at the school. All of these policies have a joint aspect to them.
Right.
And the chief and I were just talking a while ago about what could be done at the school to have more fun with and have more instruction and joint stuff. And he suggested maybe a lectureship, on joint stuff, so that no matter where the different schools were in their curriculum, there would be a guest speaker at noon, and you could go in and listen to the joint stuff.
I already have it named.
Okay. We've asked both commandants that I work for to include the Navy and Air Force in the courses that we were using. We asked to invite them to our colonels and lieutenant colonels course, because we knew that there were joint type conversations or information being put out that we were saying to Army chaplains, this is what you need to know to operate at the JTF 2 and 3 star level. And so we've tried to incorporate, I've gone to several conferences, one on religious leader liaison or engagement in CENTCOM AOR with the Air Force and Navy, and found out that there are some very clear distinctions between what they believe they're allowed to do, and so again, it's just, you know, as far as the Armed Forces Chaplain School, there's tremendous opportunity down there, and the Navy chaplain based at JFCOM, who's retiring, Paul Wrigley, has worked very hard to get the COCOM chaplains to come in and through their commander state a need for JPME, joint level JPME, that Paul or JFCOM would validate. Now JFCOM is going away, but the joint community can validate, and then we can educate it right there at our school, because that's what we're designing for the Army anyway.
We have to. All of these policies, everything you've done is really in a joint world. One quick question, I'll shut up. I gotta think of the question one more time. Doctrine. Has there been a joint pub on religious support in the last 10 years? Because the last one I saw was in 1990s.
JP 1-05 was just finished probably 2 years ago, and is very clear and supports or lays the groundwork for what we followed up with the Chief of Chaplain's policy on the religious leader liaison.
That might be a good topic for a lecture down there at lunchtime.
All right. Yeah, on this one, there was some confusion or buy-in, if you will, lack of buy-in by some of our chaplains who said that their endorsers would not allow them to do this. So part of the purpose has been to kind of clear the battlefield and said this is a legitimate mission. This is one of the mandates in the security and stability operations during Eric Keller's watch, that was one of the requirements that the Army was going to expect from us. The other intent was to ensure that chaplains, when they were engaged in this, they never freelanced it, that it was always, it belonged to the commander, and they didn't go off on their own.
They didn't lose their non-combatant status.
They did it under the supervision, guidance, direction of the commander. And the other thing that this did, again, there's a little sentence in here, but I remember it being written. It was also to give some weight to the importance of the chaplain assistant. Chaplain assistants will integrate into the security mission as necessary and perform their duties consistent. So we wanted to say this is not just the chaplain's role of religious liaison, that you should train. The chaplain assistant has some responsibility, and in some cases could be doing it. So that was some of the background along with what Phil mentioned.
And we didn't want the commander putting the chaplain in a place where significant actionable intelligence was available, and the chaplain had to wrestle with his or her conscience about what to reveal, because the commander had not given the chaplain anyone else to be on the team that could hear that and take it and not have any qualms about how it was used.
I understand. Okay. This one says Chief of Chaplains Policy Mobilization of Army National Guard Joint Force Headquarters Chaplains at Army Installations.
Can I speak to that?
No, sir.
These are all about the same time, too. 08.
08. There's a ton of them in 08.
Well, the Joint Force Headquarters was just, that concept was just standing up or getting solid backing from everyone. So that was part of it, I'm sure.
Yeah. This was to highlight the importance of the Joint Force Headquarters chaplains in their primary mission to their state. We had a couple of states that under R4Gen and the operationalizing of the Guard and Reserve, that lo and behold, when we were looking to the Joint Force Headquarters chaplain for something, he or she had mobilized in support of another task force and left their state uncovered. And our point was, wait a second, with Siberni and other, border operations, humanitarian assistance, earthquakes, floods. You got a pretty important role in support of your state in the TAG and in mentoring as a Joint Force Headquarters chaplain, and therefore keep watch on that job and don't get kind of caught up in some other things. This was, as I recall, something to just emphasize the importance of Joint Force Headquarters. Again, there's another, it's interesting, as I read this, there's an interesting sentence. Garrison chaplains will not mobilize a Joint Force Headquarters chaplain as an asset to augment installation and support. They remain under Title 32 authority to fulfill their roles. And here's what was going on. We had some Joint Force Headquarters chaplains who had gone and done rear detachment support because it was a 365, if you will. I won't go into the specific ones, but I remember them now as I read this. This was sort of to stop that practice. And hey, if you're a Joint Force Headquarters chaplain, we're not going to touch you. And please don't go volunteer to be the rear detachment for Fort Campbell, Kentucky, for example.
Or Fort Bragg.
Or Fort Bragg.
Yes, sir. I understand.
or
this
or
one.
the CDT.
Yeah.
That's going with the division or corps.
I was reservist for 9 years. I used to look for jobs. That happened all the time.
It's interesting how these come back to you.
Yes, sir. Well, part of this is I'm trying to make sure I explain it. Part of it is there are not many people that really know why, and so two of them are here. This won't take much longer. This is U.S. Army Chaplaincy Lessons Learned program.
I got it, but I'm going to let him speak to it, and I'll add to it because this one is
that's important.
This one is very, very important, and I'm not even so sure where we are on it today.
For a long time, the chaplaincy had not done Army things Army ways. Let's say we were not integrated in the process. We weren't very good at even doing our own lessons learned. So when the Center for Army Lessons Learned came and asked us, but occasionally publicized things that we had no cut on, we found that in conjunction with trying to justify a force design change, a change in doctrine, a change in leader development, any of the .mil PF domain, we needed data to do that. And we did not have a way of collecting that and synthesizing it and then taking the substance of it and integrating it into the rest of the Army. So the chaplain's, chief of chaplain's policy on lessons learned was to, one, make sure that we had a central collection point for data that was coming in, to remind folks that 100 days into the deployment and after the deployment they owed an AAR about their experience so that others could learn from the pros and cons of what they did.
Is that still CDID, sir?
It's still CDIDs.
Okay, thank you.
And again, to do any type of change, we validated to the Army that we provide 2 key essential services. We do our Title 10 function of rites, sacraments, and ordinances. We also advise the commander. The Army came back and said, we validate those 2 key functions, and we will fund you to write doctrine, to train, to do leader development, to do force design, to enhance that capability. That's how it's done. That's how you can get. And we constantly have to update those kinds of things. But we didn't have any data. We didn't have a way of collecting data to support that, to confirm, because that's already looked on a 2-year basis now.
This has been something that was a concern really since 9/11. And it's not just a chaplain unique problem, it's a problem in the Army, and the Army history, Army history, which is a part of this. But there was a disconnect, and who's in charge? And how do we get these valuable lessons learned? And there's a trend right now in this current war. Instead of getting lessons learned in AARs, chaplains as well as other soldiers are writing books, and they're giving their personal accounts, and they're getting I don't know if they're getting paid for it or not, but they're writing either on their blog sites, but it's not coming through the Army. So this was an intent to say, There is a process, and our process is going to parallel what the Army Lessons Learned program is doing. There was some frustration and tension because Call at Center for Army Lessons Learned at Fort Leavenworth was so was wanting to try to get this jump started. They were almost ahead of our branch, of which, you know, the branch components are part of that. So this was to clean up the battlefield. Now, there was another sort of a management cleanup, reducing redundancies, clarifying how this goes through, and that was at the school. I might be getting something from CDID, but did the commandant know about it? And if you read this Lessons Learned, the commandant is the executive proponent of lessons learned from our branch, and the co-chairs are the director of training and the CDID. This was also an attempt to marry up. It's not just a CDID issue, but you need to walk across that bridge between combat developments, training, get that, and get these lessons learned to these students who are about to deploy, and within weeks of graduation, they're downrange. That was the intent. Let's clarify the process and establish,
formalize the relationship between
formalize relationships.
What CDIDs did.
Well, and
went
also,
into training. When it carried. I mean, everything we did almost went right to the training director.
And also to emphasize the importance of the role of 357, who has really the stuff should be rolled up and brought to us so that we can write the history. So that's what that was all about. And that one was very hard, and I'm not so sure we're there yet, to be quite honest.
We haven't cracked the code, because we still have not only what's coming from downrange. Again, an AR is only as good as the time you put into it. Everybody's tired when they come home. I don't think they realize the end result of what can happen or what you can do with a good, well-written AR. You have all the tremendous amount of data that comes from a rotation at the combat training centers, and collecting that quarterly. I hate to admit that while I was down there, I should have had the 2.5 years. I should have had 10 reports from each CTC, so 30-some reports, and I had 2 that I can speak of. Now, we've gotten better, and we've gotten better actually from the Guard and Reserve. When they have come back from downrange, their organizations have written some tremendous AARs lately and made sure that CDIDs and FORSCOM had them. So that part of it's working well.
Well, but let me give you an example. Let's take DLA or AMC. I mean, how has the war changed any new kit bag that we need, a new chaplain's kit, or how we're doing ministry? And to be honest, John, I'm not so sure, at least I haven't seen in writing, hey, this is the stuff that works or doesn't. Or let's take the chapel in a box. Do these things work or don't they? So there's some logistical things that, you know, what have we learned in this war? And we need to address it. I remember one conference that we held that was called by Jerry Haverick when he was the deputy.
I remember. And
we brought in all the folks that were just coming out of theater, and we presented. We were all required to present our lessons learned. I still have that. Now, what we did with that and the follow-on, and one of the things that's dropped off the market since really under Dave Hicks's days is the old, what was that thing? The training. Rick Coolbars is really a big proponent of it. You know what I'm talking about? I can't remember it now.
I think so.
Anyway, can't remember. Must not be important because we.
Well,
no,
but the deal. I was there when Jerry Haverick did that. And, there were guys there from all over, special operations. And
it was awesome.
But then the war changed, and one of the enemies of analysis of lessons learned is that when you change the whole environment, people tend to say, well, that was the old war, now we got to get ready for something new.
But see, that was why we wanted things coming through CDID, so doctrine, we could look at it and we could determine, is this a change in doctrine, or is this just a TTP that was appropriate for that circumstance and is not trending across different circumstances. The other thing that we thought CDID would be able to do is not only take what they had synthesized, but through our sauce, the Support Operations System had a way to put it back out to the field. And it wasn't just and it was a pull type system. We made sure it was on the net, and then they could pull whenever they needed it. And we thought that was a great, why have it come from outside where our sauce was being run and have an extra link? We already had to talk about doctrine.
Yeah. But this is an Army problem, not just a chaplain branch, because it gets back to what drives the train. Is training driving the Army, or is doctrine driving the Army? And I think slowly, as we now transform under this new chief of staff, I think we're going to see that doctrine is going to get back in the driver's seat.
Well, you have the experience downrange. You synthesize that. Doctrine is behind. It catches up, and then leader development and training follow.
Roger that.
And doctrine is the basis for it.
So that was a complicated one.
Yes, sir, but it's fascinating because I understand from a historical point of view, if you get 60% of the reports from downrange, you're doing a great job. Even if you send history detachment teams, or even if you send people out to get doctrine or lessons learned. We had 2 chaplains who came to Shield Desert Storm, John Rasmussen and Greg Hill.
Right.
And they did a fine job, but the point is, how do you expect 2 chaplains on foot to cover 565 chaplains who are scattered all over Saudi Arabia? Well, you don't. They try to go to the key headquarters and stuff where you find things. But nevertheless, there must be a better way downrange.
Well, the other thing too is this collection policy was in need. I mean, when you have Army Service Component, as an example, Army Service Component Command Headquarters go from 15 down to 8 personnel, but your functions and role and mission hasn't changed. We didn't have the data to support that argument. We had 2 3-stars sit and tell the trade-out commander, General Wallace at the time. One of them stood up and said, chaplains did nice things. And the other said, chaplains, we depend on them a lot. Everybody else was talking about capability and capacity. And so it was very difficult for the chief to stand up at that point and try to make any headway when everyone else is talking capability, capacity, and here the best we can say is chaplains are nice guys and they do a lot for us.
And again, let me just conclude this, but it gets back to my telling you about the Fort Hood chaplains. You know, are we training the right things? You know, are we taking what we're learning, what we specifically the last 9.5 years, and are we implementing it to these young troops who are going to go out, many for their first deployment? And that really, to me, would be the end state of all this. Let's get the best training so that they don't have to make the same mistakes, and we're just kind of going in a cycle. This last one, the draft policy for stabilization of chaplains post-deployment. I can speak to that. You want to start first? Because this one is near and dear to me. It's really a personnel issue.
Yes, sir.
Were you here when that happened?
No, sir.
Here's what happened. When shortly after the surge, we started to see some problems on units, especially as units would redeploy. There was a spike, significant spikes in UCMJ actions, domestic violence, alcohol, drug abuse, those kinds of things. And we saw that at a couple of places. We saw that at Fort Carson, with a lot of some gang violence, and when they had I want to say there were 7 murders or 11 murders done by soldiers, many of whom had not deployed. And then we had Fort Campbell come back, and we started seeing a lot of suicides and violent behavior. Epicons were sent out to both Carson and to Fort Campbell, and one of the evaluations was that most of the acting out of the soldiers does not occur until almost 180 days when they're back on the ground, which was also the same time that most people were starting to deploy and go to schools or to their next assignment, etc. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Army looked at some key people to include chain of command, and that one of those key components of stability in a military community was the UMT. And specifically he said, you need to look at, and we looked at Fort Campbell. That was the one that we looked at, and we stabilized for 120 days every chaplain after they returned. Now, it had a snowball effect because we took care of Campbell, but then we have the rest of the Army, and arguably our Corps is not big enough to do this stabilization, and so therefore we left gaps and underlaps across the Army. But the Army was onto something that you can't send guys downrange and come back, and then in 45 to 90 days, as people get off of block leave, they begin getting feelings again, and there's no one there to watch after them because we've just separated and sent them to the four winds.
Yes,
so
sir.
that was the intent of this. We really wanted resilience, stabilization, maintaining some sense of community and the chain of command, so that soldiers, they developed a relationship with the chaplain, the confidentiality, and not to lose that strength of that bond they have with their chaplain.
Okay. I have two more subjects. I don't know whether you have time or if you have the energy, but I'll just mention them. This one is the AAR chaplaincy supported multi-casualty dignified transfer.
Right.
It's 8 soldiers conducted on 6 October 2009. This looks like an after-action report, not a policy, but I picked it up when I was picking up the policies. The last
Is that
one,
in Dover?
yeah, I think that's right. The last one is a pilot program evidently to bring on Catholic chaplains from the Philippines and other places that are not citizens.
Right. I can answer.